Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. I am delighted to welcome you all to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Stan Veuger. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI. Good afternoon as well to our online viewership behind those cameras over there. For our online viewers, we're going to have a Q&A later. Please submit your questions to catherine.camberg@aei.org or via Twitter with hashtag AskAEIEcon. Anyway, I'm delighted. I'm just going to speak for 90 seconds, and then it's these two guys for the rest of the afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this event on the future of European security and on the role that the European Union and its institutions will play in that future. The context, I think, is well known. Russia's war against Ukraine is about to enter its third year, with increasing calls from the American right to abandon Ukraine, leave it to its own devices. Meanwhile, new sources of instability continue to surface in the Middle East and Africa, and I don't want to say everywhere, but in a lot of places. And now, as the European Union adopts an increasingly important role as a security actor, what role will the Union's institutions play in responding to these new, often harsh realities of security policy in the region and beyond? And how can they help reinvigorate the transatlantic relationship and partnership? Today's event will be a conversation about those topics between my colleague, Dalibor Rohac, also a senior fellow here, and Stefano Sannino. Mr. Sannino is, Dalibor, you don't get an introduction. Mr. Sannino is Secretary General of the European External Action Service. That's the diplomatic service and combined foreign and defense ministry of the European Union, if you want to think of it that way. It's a position he's held since January 2021. His wealth of prior experience includes postings as Italian ambassador to Spain and Andorra, and as permanent representative of Italy to the European Union, as well as senior roles with the European Commission, Italian Prime Minister's Office, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. After their conversation, Dalibor and Mr. Sannino will take some audience questions, so start thinking about them. Short, ideally ending in a question mark. With that introduction, let's get started here. Dalibor, Mr. Sannino, please take it away. Thank you.
Stan, thank you so much for that very dynamic and lively introduction. Ambassador, welcome to AEI. It's a great pleasure to have you here. What I was hoping you might do for us today is to provide us with a little bit of a tour d'horizon, zooming in on important hotspots around the world, regions, crises, situations that are of mutual concern to Americans and to Europeans. And perhaps we can use those examples to explain how Europe and the EU, Europeans are responding to these situations, and also understand better how the EU as an institution is adding value to some of these policy responses, and perhaps highlight instances where the EU is actively leading broader international coalitions. And I think it is fitting to start this conversation in Ukraine. Right now there is a supplemental bill slowly making its way through the Senate. We still don't know how far it will get in the legislative process, and arguably a lot hinges on that outcome. Meanwhile, the EU, perhaps defying the odds, has managed to reach a consensus on the 50 billion Ukraine facility. Recently, your own boss, Mr. Borrell, recently was, or perhaps still is, visiting Kiev. But the question is, what happens if the United States, for reasons that might be beyond our control, fails to support Ukraine in a sustained way going forward? Can the EU and Europeans fill the shoes of the United States, particularly as it comes to military assistance? I think that, to me, is perhaps the central question that we should be asking ourselves, and that future Ukrainian victory really hinges on. And the scale of the military assistance that the US has provided is one that is comparable to the one that the Europeans have provided, and taking all, I think it's worth reminding the American audience that taken together, European assistance far exceeds, those commitments far exceed the U.S. assistance, but there is still no substitute for the U.S. defense industrial base as of now. So is there a sense of urgency around perhaps being ready to fill in America's shoes should it become necessary?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here this afternoon. Pleasure to see you, and also to all of present, but also those on screen. Let me maybe add one element to your presentation. It is true that we have just approved this sort of supplemental financing for Ukraine of 50 billion euros, so it's $54 billion, but that's on the top of other 96 that we have been approved in the coming months. So this brings essentially our overall assistance to $150 billion in these 2 years, which is a considerable effort. And as you rightly said, I mean, it has been very much also a considerable effort on the US side. And I think that I've never liked too much the beauty context on who is doing more than the other. I think that we are together in this endeavor, because we are defending here not only the freedom of a country, but also a set of principles that have been very much at the basis of our life and of our being together for the last 70 years. So I hope that from that point of view, we can continue, let's say, working hand in hand to counter this aggression and to make it sure that this threat can be rejected. Now, I don't want to, let's say, to preempt the work that is being done. I think that there is still a lot of activity going on. I've been during these days also on the Hill, both at the Senate and at the House, to meet with different congressmen and senators. And I hope that a solution can be found to continue supporting Ukraine militarily. You have rightly said that the support of the United States when it comes to the military aspect has been essential, and it is the case. We are trying on the European side to ramp up our industrial capacity to make sure that we can create, let's say, a sustainable possibility to support Ukraine, but also to support the European Union and to support the European flank of the NATO alliance. We have had for many years a discussion about the importance of stepping up our efforts in the defense sector. So now here we are. It's what we are trying to do. But once again, I think that this is an element of that we need to underline, that this is done in full complementarity with what is being done in the context of NATO. The European Union is not a military alliance, let's be clear, and it's not our DNA. But it is true that we are working much more in the defense area. We have developed and we are developing defense capabilities, but we are trying to go also a little bit beyond this and work also on other aspects of security. And that implies all the work on hybrid threats, on cyber, on disinformation, all aspects that unfortunately are, I don't know if as relevant as the hard security, the military security, but certainly have had a very significant role in the context of this war.
I mean, I have to press you on this a little more still. The EU pledged to provide Ukraine with 155 millimeter shells by March. That goal is likely to be missed. Apparently, there might be 1.1 million shells delivered by the end of this year. Are you happy with the progress in terms of beefing up, the EU's and Europe's hard power and it's sort of making its posture on the global stage slightly more muscular than was the norm in the past? Or do you think much more needs to be done? Really, the sort of order of magnitude is still wrong relative to the size of the Russian threat in particular?
Look, the interesting thing is that we are speaking a lot about the 1 million ammunition round, and it is true that there was a sort of commitment to reach 1 million by March 24. Now it is true that we have, in terms of donation, we have not come to that level, and we are a little bit above 500,000. And we are confident that by the end of the year we should go beyond 1 million. But it is also true that the production which is sold in Ukraine is very consistent, and it's, I would say, if you put together what is being sold and what is being donated, we are well above 1 million ammunition round. And the capacity is still quite significant, because we are exporting also to third countries. So now the question is how to orientate also the production in this moment, and how to prioritize the effort in Ukraine. And that's also another aspect. All that said, I agree with you that still an additional efforts needs to be made in order to ramp up sufficiently the industrial production in the military sector. And that's what we are trying to do, creating mechanisms that are maximizing the impact of the work that our member states are doing. If you are a large member states of the European Union, say Germany, you can have a huge impact because you are, let's say, putting a significant amount of money on the table. If you are a smaller country, and we have a lot of small countries in the European Union, you are doing maybe in terms of percentage of your GDP a lot, because I mean you are, and there are countries that are really doing huge effort from that point of view. But in terms of absolute terms, no, the absolute figure is not sufficient to have a real impact on the industrial production. And that's why it's important that we join all these requests into a mechanism of joint procurement that can have an impact and then can, let's say, push the industrial sector to make the necessary investments to ramp up the production. We have been started already this work a couple of years ago, since the beginning of the war. It's starting to produce results, and it is encouraging, I think, the results that we have reached up until now. But again, there is still work to be done, and we are ready to take this road.
I have a question that maybe is so closer to your actual day job, which has to do with one element of the European External Action Service, which struck me at its inception as a really important contribution that the EEAS has made, namely the creation of the East Stratcom Task Force, which was a unit designed already in the very early stages of Russia's aggression against Ukraine to counter Russian information operations primarily, and other sources of disinfo and sort of manipulative tricks deployed by unfriendly regimes. What do you think are the sort of main lessons learned from the early years of its existence, and what are the plans for the future, and how has it adapted to the reality of this full-scale war that Russia is waging against Ukraine?
Well, I think that the for information manipulation and interference, we call it FIMI. It's the acronym, because at the end of the day, what is worrying for us is not only the disinformation, but when the disinformation is used and abused to, let's say, change political decisions and to alter the democratic processes. So for us it was important since the very beginning, first of all, to debunk the number of manipulation of information, to make it clear, at least to the public opinions, that have the possibility to check which are the different sources of information. And then there is also and it's what we are trying to do more and more, and very much also in cooperation with the United States, by the way, to act upon and to make it sure that this kind of manipulation is not longer possible. it's a very thin line between freedom of information and manipulation of information that needs to be drawn. And I understand that it's not always easy to take the decision, but I think that it is essential if we want to preserve the openness of our systems and of our society, and also of our system of information, that this is not abused by actors that are, let's say, trying to manipulate this space. What we are trying to do, so it's, I would say, to monitor, to debunk, to sanctions when we feel it is necessary. Sometimes to shut down some of the media, some of these outlets that are again abusing our system. And I think that we need to also thinking about the future, or the old digital space, and even more so for what could come out of the artificial intelligence, to make it sure that the standards that are regulating this sector are protective of the human dimension, are protecting of the rights of the individuals in that space. And this is another, let's say, important chapter. We have worked a lot on the digital space, and we have started working, I'm speaking about the European Union, and we have started working now about the definition also of some rules for the artificial intelligence.
So while we're on this topic, at 6 o'clock, Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin will broadcast. You see, we arrange the timing for this event so that it doesn't interfere. But no, that's obviously a joke. But will Tucker Carlson be sanctioned by the EU?
I don't know why this voice is going to start spreading around, but to my knowledge, there is no idea of sanctioning him. So it's another story. There again, it's a question of freedom of expression, freedom of journalism, impact, how the information can be used. But I would not like to enter into this. Even, let's say, before having seen the outcome of this work.
Somebody started the rumor, so I had to ask you. Now,
a lot of misinformation.
Ambassador, I think that what makes your job, and also the jobs of your colleagues at the External Action Service, different from the jobs of your counterparts at the State Department, and perhaps what makes them both more interesting and more difficult is that you are expected to speak and act on behalf of 27 very diverse countries that are very rarely in complete agreement on important issues of the day. So to just give you one example, a sort of uncontroversial one, how about the Middle East, right? That prompted very different recent events have prompted very different responses in different member states. So the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, Petr Fiala, in October suggested that after the October 7 attacks, the Czech Republic might move its embassy to Jerusalem. This week we heard from President Higgins of Ireland, who said something very different, who called for an immediate ceasefire and said that a continuation of Israel's campaign would have, I quote, leave any respect for humanitarian law in tatters. Now, your own boss, Mr. Borrell, gave a speech last month where he said that Hamas was financed by the government of Israel in an attempt to weaken the Palestinian Authority led by Fatah, and suggested that a two-state solution imposed from the outside, I quote, would bring peace even though Israel insists on the negative. So I have to ask you, what did he mean by that? And perhaps more broadly, and more importantly, how do you think about the EEAS's job in navigating, through divisive issues such as these, and adding value and making sure that the EU doesn't just become the lowest common denominator, but actually makes a
as you said, this makes the difficulties and the beauty of this work. This is not only about foreign policy. I mean, it's essentially the story of the European Union. It's the story of managing to find agreement on issues that are not necessarily seen in the same way in all the 27 member states. We are a union of 27 sovereign countries that have retained their sovereign prerogatives, but at the same time have agreed collectively to cede in certain areas, or if they agree also in areas that are not covered by the treaties, part of their sovereignty. So it's the whole effort of the European Union is to manage to reach an agreement on issues that sometimes are controversial and where we start from different points of view. Is this an exercise which is easy or rapid? It's not easy and it's not rapid, but it's also, for me, essential. And when I think about the alternative, I really do not see an alternative for us. We are a union of minorities, as I was saying before. We are a union of countries that, with a few exceptions, are relatively small in size. If we are unable to join forces, then we would be unable to play any kind of role in the world and on the international scene. And it has been exactly this complex exercise that has managed to preserve peace in the continent for 70 years, that has managed to allow us to become the most relevant trade bloc in the world, has managed to allow the European Union to become a standard setter and norm setter. So, I mean, for as painful and difficult as it may be, still, I think, worth the effort that we are all making. Now, when it comes to foreign policy, this becomes even more difficult because it goes into really the prerogatives of the sovereignty of the member states. And it is true that sometimes you may find yourself in situations like the one that you just mentioned in the Middle East crisis, where, let's say, the positions are different, and when there is also a lot of history behind of positions being taken by the different countries. That said, and I don't want to embellish necessarily the story, it is true that sometimes we tend to focus more on the differences than on the common ground that we may have. And even in the Middle East crisis, in spite of all the things that you've said and of the different positions, there are a certain number of, I think, very important common elements. We all think that all the 27 think that is important, the security of Israel. We all believe that at a certain point the Palestinians have to be given the possibility of living in a country. We all believe in the idea that terrorism should not be hosted in Gaza. We all believe in the need to have a solution that is permanent, it's stable, and it's not, let's say, linked to the events and the occurrences of the specific historic moment. So, I mean, I think that there are a lot of things that are in common, that we have in common. We all believe it is important to release the hostages. We all believe that it's important to give humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians. So again, and that's our work, is to try to build on this, to try to minimize the impact of the differences and to maximize the capacity of the common ground. It's again, it's not an easy work. Sometimes it takes a lot of time. It depends also on how much this is threatening us directly. If there is a less distant threat, maybe you take more time. If the threat is directed more, let's say, in a specific manner towards us, then decisions are taken very rapidly and very easily, and even differences are easily overcome. So there is not an easy answer to your question, but that's, the price, I think, and it's a price worth paying, of preserving this very unique construction of a union, which is not a federation, but at the same time, it's aspiring to be something much more than just a sum of a number of countries.
So I note that you very tactfully avoided commenting on the High Representative's
No, I mean, I'm
talk,
not going to avoid any
which is probably a
comments.
wise
I mean,
move.
as I say, I mean, I said it before. This is, I mean, if you go around Europe, this is a conflict which has been unfortunately raging for many, many years. And so you have different positions which are very much linked also to the story of each country, or also to the personal story of each person. So it's not that I want to avoid commenting. I'm just saying that the emotional part, I would say, it's still very present, and it's something on which we'll need to work on.
I think it is hard to disagree with what you said about the EU finding the strength and unity to act in crisis situations when its immediate interests are affected. Now, a skeptic would say that a flip side of that is the EU's perhaps failure to devise sustained and focused strategies to engage with countries very often in its immediate neighborhood, such as the Western Balkans or the Caucasus or North Africa, where we've seen limited progress and where there is sort of continuous sort of sources of instability sort of lingering. Do you sort of share a sort of somewhat critical view towards the way say the sort of Eastern Partnership has kind of been in an ossified state and hasn't really sort of served as a tool to truly project influence to the east of the EU's borders, or do you think similarly the EU's sort of engagement in the Western Balkans and in other on its southern flank should be similarly rethought, or do you think things are roughly speaking on the right trajectory?
No, I disagree on the idea that I would say we have been unable to look at our neighborhood or to devise, let's say, perspectives for our neighborhood. I think that if I look at the two policies of the European Union, the enlargement policy and the neighborhood policy, they are very, very clear and very solid policies, which are based on a number of criteria, principles which are underpinned by substantial financial support. Then we come to the point of saying who the countries that are either in the Western Balkans or in the neighborhood, who is willing or not to stay within the framework that we have commonly agreed. I can be more explicit. The perspective of the enlargement of the European Union to the Western Balkans dates back to many years. I mean, to the Thessaloniki Agreement. So we are going back to decades. Of this, the country of the Western Balkans, some have managed to reach the results. Croatia has become a member of the European Union. Why so? Because Croatia has embraced the European perspective in a very clear way. They have made the reforms, they have restructured their economy, they have restructured their state of rule of law, the judiciary, and progressively they have managed to enter the European Union. The same has been true for all the countries that have joined the European Union even before, during the fifth enlargement. Now, there are other countries that maybe are, let's say, less determined or less focused on this effort. And that's why the process takes longer, because it takes longer for them to make hard decisions to establish the rule of law, to fight corruption, to restructure their economic systems. And, but is this a failure of the policy or is a failure of the governments in question? It's a question mark. When you think about neighborhood policy, we have tried to develop a policy for all the countries, both in the East and in the South, providing them not only a perspective of, let's say, much closer cooperation, but also a perspective of progressive integration into our single market, which is an important, let's say, possibility, because it's a market of an integrated market of 500 million people with a very high level of economic capacity. There are countries that have gone more rapidly into this process and have integrated much more. See what is happening now, even with Ukraine in a state of war, or with Moldova from that point of view, or like Morocco from in the southern neighborhood. There are other countries that have, let's say, once again, been less willing to move into this direction. I mean, I'll take one which is, I would say, epitomatic from that point of view, Belarus, which has gone in a completely different directions. Is it, how to say, the fact that the policy was not good, or was rather the fact that the country was not willing to move in a certain direction? So I understand it is still, I would say, challenging us, because we need to be able to give replies also to this difficult situation, is what we are trying to do. We have devised, for example, now a mechanism to favor the gradual integration of the Western Balkan countries into the European mechanisms, single market, programs, and so on, to facilitate even further this process. We have now, for example, negotiating a partnership with Egypt, which is covering a number of different areas to facilitate this process. But once again, I don't think that you need to speak about the failure of a policy because it has not been, let's say, been embraced necessarily by the countries that have devised this with us, by the way.
So if I may, I'd like to go back to this question of hard powers. I think we've all been following with great concern the deterioration of the security situation in the Red Sea, and the economic impact has already been felt, particularly in Europe. Arguably, this is an emergency, and I mean the international community is responding. There is the Operation Prosperity Guardian, led by the U.S. Navy, and arguably it is the United States that is doing much of the heavy lifting in this operation, and also in the strikes against the Houthi and other Iranian-sponsored, Iranian-backed targets. Yet, a skeptical American could argue that it is Europe that is primarily affected by this crisis. It is, this is the trade route between Europe and Asia. It is, shipments from Asia to Europe that now have to take this longer route around the Cape of Good Hope. Now, the EU, I know, is responding. There is a naval operation that's being prepared that should be signed off on the 19th of February. Yet, a skeptical American would say it's too little, too late. Why aren't Europeans doing more to protect freedom of navigation on sort of sea lanes that are vitally relevant to them, much more so than to Americans?
Well, freedom of navigation is relevant for everybody, because this is not a route which is only for European ships. It's a route where everybody can go through. That said, as you said, Aspidis, this operation will start mid-February. The assets will be deployed soon after, and we will take our part of the share and our and of the responsibility. It is true that to finalize the decision process in the European Union, it takes a little bit longer than you can do with the executive order of the president, but it has to do with what I was saying before, with the structure and the way we work. But in the meantime, let's say countries, member states are present already and are doing their part. But I wouldn't say that because this has taken a few weeks more, it's a lack of will or a lack of determination or a laziness on our side.
Now, every foreign policy conversation in Washington includes a China-related question, and I'm sure this one will be no different, but I don't have an explicitly China-related question, but maybe we'll get to sort of China in a roundabout way, because I would like to ask you about your own thinking about the EU's Latin America strategy, because it's fair to say that both the United States and the EU have a little dropped the ball in Latin America, and there has been a vacuum that has been actually filled predominantly by China and Chinese investment and sort of economic ties to China. And it strikes me that the recent political change in a country like Argentina, with a staunchly pro-Ukrainian, China-skeptical president, might open an opportunity to maybe start afresh. Is there any chance for a EU Mercosur trade deal, or are there any sort of rumors in Brussels about new efforts to bring Latin America closer to the orbit of Western liberal democracies?
Well, first of all, maybe there is an element of Latin. We speak about Latin America. It's a lot of things. Latin America. It's a very complex realities. You have Central America. You have South America, and within South America, you have different realities. So it's a little bit difficult to really to make a sort of generalization about the how to deal with that, because there are different problems that we are, trying to face with different instruments. All in all, we have tried to redefine, it was not too long ago, our strategy with Latin America, again trying to move away from the more classical donor-recipient pattern and trying to move more into a partnership among equals with countries that have a huge potential. And by the way, it's something that maybe it's not always immediate as a thought, but the level of the European investments in Latin America are greater than the level of the European investments in India, China, and Russia put together. So it's not that I would say it's a neglected continent that we have completely forgotten. And the economic, the cultural presence, but also the family links with the continent are very substantial. The country I know best, it's there was a certain moment and the idea of giving citizenship to all Italians that had at least one Italian grandfather, and the calculation was that it would have implied giving citizenship to 60 million people in Latin America. So another Italy essentially in Latin America. So it's I think that we have to be careful about generalization and characterization, which are not giving the sense of the work that we have been doing. Take a country like Spain. Spain has a presence and network in Latin America, which is unbelievable. Many of the big companies in Spain, the bulk of their business is in Latin America. So careful about, let's say, going to let's say, not specific with that. That we need to, again, to do more. Let's say always you can do more and you have to do more. It is true that there has been a wave at a certain moment of the Chinese presence, which was especially in raw materials or investing substantially. Is this, let's say, is this economic or better commercial presence created or altered the links between Europe and Latin America? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. If you look at the trade patterns, it is true that the trade has increased enormously between the continent, but this is true also for all of us. This does not mean that we have, let's say, completely changed the pattern of our alliances. The European Union is still, has a free trade association agreement, which has a very strong free trade component with Central America since already, I think, almost 20 years. And there are bilateral or plurilateral agreements with a number of countries like Peru, Colombia, Ecuador. So it's, the situation is or with Chile, by the way, or with Mexico. So you have a lot of network of also of trade agreements. Mercosur is the missing link. And it's a big bite. It has always been. We've been negotiating for quite some time. Each time that we have a feeling that we are almost there to finalize the agreement, there is always an element which is derailing the process. Let's hope that, again, the landscape in the coming months will allow us to finalize this work. But on this, I concur with you that it's a little bit a pity that we have this element not yet in place.
Good. I think this is the right time to open it up. So we'll take a mix of in-person questions and online questions. If you're asking a question online, please email it to my colleague, Catherine.Camberg@aei.org, or you can use the hashtag EU Defense, written as one word, spelled with an S, because we're in America, on the platform formerly known as Twitter. And if you are asking a question in person, please raise your hand, wait for the microphone, introduce yourself, and try to phrase your question as a question. Gentleman on the right.
Yeah, Ken Meyercord. Does the BRICS countries constitute as much a threat to the EU as it does to the United States?
The BRICS is a strange association because it, especially after the new enlargement, put together a number of countries which are, let's say, linked more, but what they do not like that to what they like. So it's difficult to have a sort of capacity to be effective if you do not have something to fight for, but you have only something to fight against. As European Union, we have, let's say, as we say in our jargon, take note of what has happened with the BRICS, which means that we think that it's important, but it's not creating a major challenge for us. Personally, I do believe that we need to look carefully at the evolution of, I don't know how you want to call it, I don't have a better expression, the evolution of the Global South. And of a number of countries that are rejecting the set of norms and rules that have been at the basis of our system for many decades. I think that we need to work on that. We need to be able to not only be critical, but also make concrete proposals about how we want to work with these countries, and also about how we have to maybe to restructure or redefine the international order, taking more into account a number of realities that maybe were different or not as present as it used to be 70 years ago. The participation, for example, of the African Union to the G20 is one of those kind of things that is trying to reflect this new reality. And again, we should work more in this direction.
Lady in the back, please.
Hi. Kim Dozier, CNN analyst. To return to your comments about Gaza and how Europe is handling the issue, we've seen from here a scattershot of reports of various attacks. Are you worried in your security and intelligence services, as they are here, about a rise in anti-secular, anti-democratic attacks, one-offs inspired or otherwise? And how do you fight that?
Anti-secular, anti-Semitic.
Extremist attacks. Violent extremists who do not like what they're seeing in terms of Western support for Israel and the ongoing crisis in Gaza.
When you have a crisis with, let's say, such a strong political impact, and I was trying to express it before, even when it comes to the difficulties to find a sort of common line, certainly the risk of having uncontrolled situations is there. And that's why I think that it's important that we try to work on our common ground and what is uniting us and what we can concretely do in order to provide, let's say, concrete solution to specific problems. I was mentioning the release of hostages, I was mentioning the humanitarian assistance, so the humanitarian pauses that can allow humanitarian assistance to reach the population. And at the end of the day, the idea of creating the conditions for a two-state solutions with all the difficulties that this implies and that I'm not trying to underestimate. It's the only way, I think, where you can, let's say, reduce the level of the risk. Then you can do a number of things, and I mean, we have been mentioning some. I mean, the United States certainly has been very active from that point of view in, let's say, giving signals that are relevant in order to stabilize the situation. And we need to work in that direction. But I agree with you that there is a risk that this can generate, let's say, around the world situations which can become dangerous.
We have an online question from Wes Culp. Yesterday, Bloomberg reported that the EU is performing a risk assessment of the possibility of a second Trump administration placing heavy punitive tariffs on EU exports. Is this true? And if so, how would this impact the EU-US relationship from Brussels' point of view?
It's not. I mean, I've also read this news and a piece of news, and I was a little bit puzzled by the way it has been framed, as if there is a constant reassessment of the situation when it comes to the trade aspects in all, let's say, our relations, but it's not linked to the administration or to the elections. It's, let's say, I would say almost a regular process which is taking place. I don't know the details because honestly I was here, so I've learned from this morning from the press. But my sense is that we are not going into a sort of scenarios approach on what could happen, and I think it's honestly I do not see too much the interest to go that way.
Gentleman in the striped tie, please wait for the mic.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to be here, Ambassador. Brian McGuire, Euractiv News Agency. Sputnik and Russia Today have a long history of pro-Russian, anti-democratic disinformation, and the European Union has sanctioned them and limited their broadcast capability in Europe. Tucker Carlson has a long history of pro-Russian, anti-democratic disinformation. Is there a reason why Tucker shouldn't be sanctioned?
As I said before, I mean, we are, for the moment, I see that there is a journalist that wants to interview Vladimir Putin. I don't think that is a solid basis to sanction someone. And we will see.
But he has a long history of this.
I haven't seen, for the time being, anybody asking for him to be sanctioned.
I would say from a sort of purely self-interested American perspective, EU sanctions on Mr. Carlson would increase the likelihood of his returning here. So, so I'm not sure, which way I want to make the argument. There's a gentleman on the far left in the red tie.
Hi, I'm John Ross with Newsmax. I was at a conference this morning with Lech Walesa, the former president of Poland. He was arguing that we should be focusing more on political informational warfare inside of Russia, such as taking down the barriers for communication. Look back to the Cold War. We had Radio Free Europe, Radio America, and broadcast inside behind the Iron Curtain. And then when Gorbachev came, it brought information, brought down the Soviet Union. Shouldn't we be focusing on supporting something like a solidarity movement? Because that's what President Walesa was said. And as to Tucker, if you have a speech that you disagree with, shouldn't unpopular speech be countered with more speech instead of censorship?
Look, I mean, we have been, now I'm speaking again for the European Union, we have been quite active, but we have been active for quite a long period in supporting, let's say, independent media or human rights defenders in Russia. With the work that was, I would say, extremely, may I say, heroic by a number of persons who were really exposing themselves to the risk of retaliation and so on. This, in the last couple of years, has been literally impossible to do that in the country. Outside the country, I mean, we are all very much committed, and I would say even very vocal in trying to say a number of things, but how to work to create a network that can do that. It's something where there are some associations that are working on that.
I think we have time for one last question. Or shall we try? Let's take two questions. The gentleman in the hiking boots and the lady in the yellow jumper. We can take them jointly, and
thank you so
I'll
much.
give you the.
My name is Thanos Dimantis. I'm the executive director of the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents. I have two short questions. The number one is, what is your major fear for the next 6-7 months or the next 1 year?
Sorry?
Fear or concern. And I know that you cannot talk about the elections or the voting preferences here in the US, but I'm sure you may be able to say something about a potential change of policy on behalf of the US administration, depending on the outcome of the elections. So far, the US is really committed, the last 4 years, to be working with the EU. If this commitment is not as bold as it is today in the next 6 months, 1 year, are you prepared for a policy change on behalf of the United States? And what would that mean for you?
And if you could just pass on the mic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Una MacDonald. Actually, formerly a British Member of Parliament, but obviously not so right now. I'm permanently resident here. Question. If Ukraine does not win the battle against Russia, how fearful are at least some of your member states, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania? Latvia, I see, is preparing for war against Russia. If Ukraine does not win, how fearful is the EU that Russia will then look to extend its control over other member states of the European Union?
To the first question, I think that honestly to go into hypotheses, what if, I mean, I think that policies are based on facts, so not on hypotheses. And so for me, there is not, as I said before, I'm not particularly interested in defining scenarios for the future. I can express the hope that the strength of the transatlantic alliance will remain as it is, because at the end of the day, and I'm not speaking only about the economic figures, but I'm speaking about the political strength. This partnership has been the basis of our life and of the world as we know it now. So I mean, it's the only thing that I could say at this stage. To the question of the potential impact of a victory of Russia on Ukraine, I think that it's not something that we are contemplating exactly for the reasons that you said, because this would have a potential impact on the security of the European Union and of our member states. I'm saying very openly, and I've been also very clear in this. This is not only the Russian aggression against Ukraine is not only an existential threat to Ukraine. It's an existential threat for us. And Putin has also been very clear in saying that it's not only a war against Ukraine, but it's a war against the West and against NATO. So I think that we should all feel a little bit threatened by this.
On that note, I'm afraid we've run out of time. Ambassador Stefano Sannino, thank you so much for enlightening us and giving us this overview of European thinking, concerns, optimism, and thank you so much for joining me. And thank you all for coming, and thank you also to everybody who has tuned in online. Until next time, goodbye.
Thank you.